Once a beacon of progress in upstate New York, Buffalo rose from its position on the Great Lakes to become a city of industry, invention, and opportunity. From its earliest days when the Erie Canal Buffalo pulsed with growth and ambition. It was here that innovation in grain storage and steel production reshaped entire industries, attracting waves of workers and turning the city into one of the nation's great powerhouses. By the middle of the 20th century, more than 500,000 people lived in Buffalo, and its skyline of factories, rail terminals, and grain elevators stood as symbols of prosperity. But as the decades passed, the trajectory began to change. Factories closed, neighborhoods emptied, and the once bustling streets grew quieter. The same city that had symbolized progress and opportunity slowly became associated with struggle and decline. Today, reminders of its former glory still stand in crumbling industrial relics and proud historic buildings. Yet the population has dwindled dramatically compared to its peak. This contrast between a city that once ranked among the most America's populous and the reality of its shrinking numbers raises a compelling question. How did Buffalo, a place of such promise and energy, reach this point of decline? And why have so many residents chosen to leave the city that once promised them a future? Let's explore these questions together and uncover the forces behind Buffalo's population loss. Reason 1. Industrial decline and shifting trade routes. Buffalo's dramatic population loss is inseparable from the unraveling of its industrial foundation. For decades, the city's prosperity rested on steel, grain, and shipping, but this dependence on heavy industry made it highly vulnerable to global and domestic economic shifts. When the Street, Lawrence Seaway opened in 1959, trade routes that once passed through Buffalo were redirected, bypassing the Erie Canal and the city's grain elevators. This undercut Buffalo's strategic role as a transport hub and triggered cascading effects across its economy. At the same time, the interstate highway system diverted freight away from the Great Lakes, further eroding Buffalo's centrality in trade. The consequences for industry were devastating. Bethlehem Steel, once employing nearly 20,000 workers, steadily cut back operations until shutting down most of its facilities in the 1982nd. Republic Steel and General Motors followed the same pattern, leaving behind massive unemployment and abandoned industrial sites. The city's central terminal, once a symbol of modern rail travel, closed in 1979, underscoring the decline of passenger rail and Buffalo's shrinking connectivity. Between 1950 and 1980, Buffalo lost one-third of its manufacturing jobs, a collapse that not only destabilized the local economy, but also fueled a mass outmigration of residents seeking work elsewhere. This industrial unraveling was more than just an economic setback. It represented the dismantling of the very identity that had sustained Buffalo for over a century. The city that once thrived on its geographic advantages and industrial might suddenly found itself bypassed, outdated, and struggling to redefine its purpose in a changing world. Reason 2. Low incomes and limited job prospects. The collapse of Buffalo's industrial base did not just eliminate jobs, it dismantled the city's economic ladder. For much of the 20th century, unionized positions in steel, automotive, and grain processing provided stable wages that sustained a strong middle class. When these industries disappeared, Buffalo tried to transition towards service-based fields such as healthcare, government, and education. Yet these new jobs rarely offered the same pay or security. By the 2002, Buffalo's median income consistently trailed behind the national average, hovering around $35,000 per household. While the cost of living in the city was lower than in many other U.S. metros, stagnant wages and limited opportunities meant many families still struggled to make ends meet. The poverty rate in Buffalo was among the highest of major American cities by the late 20th century, reflecting a persistent cycle of economic hardship. For younger residents, the lack of well-paying prospects created a powerful incentive to leave. College graduates and skilled workers often sought opportunities elsewhere, accelerating a brain drain that further weakened Buffalo's recovery. What remained was an economy marked by underemployment, declining wages, and whole neighborhoods trapped in long-term poverty. So, in this situation, what matters more in keeping people rooted in a city? The promise of good jobs, or the hope of something else? Let us know what you think in the comments. Reason 3. High crime and safety concerns. Buffalo's economic decline left scars that went beyond shuttered factories and lost jobs. It also set the stage for persistent social challenges, most notably crime. As industries collapsed and unemployment surged, many neighborhoods fell into cycles of poverty that fostered higher rates of violence. By the late 20th century, Buffalo regularly appeared at the top of national rankings for violent crime, a reputation that discouraged both residents and potential investors. This stigma has endured into the present. The city records roughly 1,400 violent crimes per 100,000 residents, a rate far above the U.S. average and a constant reminder of the struggles that followed deindustrialization. The geography of crime in Buffalo underscores its deep connection with economic hardship. On the east side, an area long associated with concentrated poverty, crime rates became especially severe, fueling a sense of insecurity that pushed families to leave if they had the means. Businesses too grew hesitant to invest in districts where safety was uncertain, compounding the lack of economic opportunity. For a city already reeling from job losses and wage stagnation, the added burden of crime created another powerful reason for population decline. Perhaps most damaging was the way crime altered Buffalo's image. Once celebrated as a center of innovation and growth, the city became widely perceived as unsafe, a place where opportunity was scarce and danger was never far away. This perception, whether entirely accurate or not, was enough to steer many families, workers, and companies towards suburban areas or entirely different regions. In effect, high crime did not just reflect Buffalo's economic collapse, it accelerated the outmigration that hollowed out the city's core. Reason 4. Suburbanization and white flight. Another major force behind Buffalo's population decline was the post-war surge of suburbanization, a trend that reshaped nearly every American city but struck Rust Belt communities with particular force. After 1950, as highways expanded and car ownership grew, middle-class families found it easier to leave the crowded urban core for newly built suburbs. Buffalo was no exception. The promise of larger homes, better schools, and safer neighborhoods drew thousands outward, draining the city of both people and resources. This shift was not simply about lifestyle preference, it was also deeply racial. As the city's African-American population increased during the mid-20th century, many white residents relocated to suburban towns in a phenomenon widely described as white flight. According to historical studies, between 1,950 and 1,980, Buffalo's white population fell by nearly half, while surrounding suburban communities gained significantly. This demographic transformation left behind segregated neighborhoods in the urban core, where poverty and disinvestment became entrenched. The consequences for Buffalo were severe. As residents and businesses moved outward, the city's tax base shrank, making it harder to fund schools, maintain infrastructure, and provide public services. Meanwhile, suburban municipalities flourished, widening the economic and social divide across the metropolitan region. By the late 20th century, Buffalo's urban center bore the double burden of population loss and concentrated poverty, while its suburbs absorbed much of the region's growth. In this sense, suburbanization and white flight did more than shift population. They magnified the effects of industrial decline and economic stagnation. They accelerated the hollowing out of Buffalo's neighborhoods and left the city struggling to reinvent itself with fewer people and fewer resources. And if you find this analysis useful, please subscribe so you don't miss out on any more interesting stories. Buffalo's story is one of resilience tested by history. From its days as a booming industrial hub to its long struggle with decline, the city has embodied both the promise and peril of America's Rust Belt. The collapse of factories, the burden of low wages, the grip of crime, and the outward pull of suburbanization all combined to shrink a population that once seemed destined only to grow. And yet, even after decades of loss, Buffalo endures. Signs of renewal in recent years, whether in its medical corridor, its universities, or its waterfront redevelopment, suggest that the city is still searching for ways to reinvent itself. The question that remains is whether these sparks of progress can reverse generations of decline, or if they are simply temporary bright spots in a longer story of struggle.